Hi, this is Stephen Roselle, Senior Technical Specialist at Autodesk, and I'm going to cover part 2 of an XGen to geometry workflow for creating game hair cards. So in the previous example, I showed how you can use what are called guide curves to go in and convert those into geometry, which is a very straightforward workflow, essentially just generating meshes from curves. But in cases where you have more density, you can actually use XGen directly to generate geometry from the instances. So let's actually hide the guide curves here. And we'll go in and we'll focus on the area around the nape of the neck. So I've got a series of different descriptions that will create different looks. I've got a description for the flyaways. I've got a description here for the head hair, which is along the scalp, and then I've got a description here for the nape of the neck, which is along the back. So I'm actually going to focus just on the nape of the neck for now. And like I said before, we can use guides to actually go about generating geometry, but in that case, we have to have a lot of guides if we want to create dense cards. So what we can do instead of using the guides is we can use the instances directly. Now, typically when you're generating instances with XGen for film or visual effects, you're generating tens or hundreds of thousands of individual strands. I don't want to do that because that would be too dense. So let's actually go in and I'll just clear out all of my instances here, and I'm going to preview just the nape hair. And instead of generating all of this density, I'm going to take the density value and I'm going to dial that way down to something like 1.5. Now what that will do is it will generate far fewer instances based on what were originally, again, guides. And you can see it's just interpolations between those guides. Now I also have the ability to go in and add thickness to this. So what it looks like now is instance curves, but if I just take the width attribute and I dial that up, you can see I can add as much thickness as I need to any of those individual strips. Now what I don't necessarily want to do is use the modifiers. Now I might want to use the modifiers, which allow me to create things like noise and things like clumping, but if I just want to get a smooth, simple strip, I can turn off those modifiers or not create them to begin with. Now I do want to go in and add a little bit of tapering, but I don't want to have this taper out nearly as much as I did with the original example. So I'm actually going to go in and just loosely taper this down a little bit, but not taper it down too much, because when you're generating hair cards, you don't want to overdo it with the tapering because it will inadvertently skew the UVs. One other thing I want to control is the density, because these are actually really dense along the length, and that's controlled by the modifier CV count. I'm going to put that down to maybe 5 or 6 so that I get less density as I generate the geometry. Now I've got shadows on, which are a little confusing right now. I'm going to turn those off. And what you can see here now is I've got some very basic strips of instance geometry or instance objects that follow these guides, but I haven't actually created any geometry yet. So if I try to select these, you'll notice that they are not selectable. That's because they're not actually objects in Maya. They're simply rendered in the viewport. So what I can do is use a special selection tool, which is part of the XGen shelf, and I can use that in order to select these instances. Now that they're selected, I can use a simple conversion tool to generate geometry. Now, one thing you want to be aware of is that the instances are generated to face the camera by default. If I turn that off, then these will face in just kind of arbitrary directions, but they're not really easy to work with. So what you typically want to do is turn on face camera. And what that will do is it will conform the normals of the strips to the camera. Now you can't necessarily convert everything at once, but you can basically go through in batches and start to convert these as needed. I have still too many in here. I'm going to do something like 1.2 just to thin that out a little bit. And I'm going to make the thickness a little bit more. And let's just say that's about what I want. So now with the selection tool still active, I'm going to go in and just grab a couple of these strips. And I'll go in and use my XGen conversion, which you can't actually see there. It's off screen, but here it is. Under XGen, we have convert XGen primitives to polygons. And we have some very simple object options. So the divisions is controlled by what I mentioned before, which is this modifier CV count, but I have a separate control for the divisions along the width. So I can increase that or decrease that to make it more or less dense. I can add curvature if I want to add a bend to it to bend inward or outward. And then I have a nice option for generating UVs, either in 2x2, 3x3, or 4x4 tiles. So I'm going to choose 2x2, and that will create a separate UV shell in each quadrant of 4 quadrants of a tile. Now, I have an option to create joints. I'll talk about that in a second, but for now, let's just select a bunch of these and go in and do a conversion. So what that will do is it will generate geometry in the same exact location and position and orientation as those XGen instances. And if I select these, you can see now that I get strips that will essentially look exactly like the resulting instances, except these are now actual Maya objects. I can actually go in and I can grab a vertex and edit those just like I would with any other Maya object. And in turn, I can right click, and assuming I have my materials set up, I can go in and I can just directly apply a material to this in order to get that kind of instanced look on my objects. So now you can see, you know, if I pull back, that starts to look like clumps of hair. But again, that was all generated from XGen instances. Now, in some cases, I might have hero hairs, and let's use the flyaways again as an example for this. Now, with the flyaways, I don't necessarily want to create all the instances, but let's say that I wanted to go in and do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to go in and do a simple CV count. I'll go in and I'll set my density to be 1. Or actually maybe a little bit higher than 1. At any rate, it doesn't really matter. I'm not going to go crazy with this, but let's say I wanted to create just 2 or 3 of those instances. Now what I can do once again is go in and just select one of these instances directly. And actually forgot to do the width. Let's bump up the width, and I'll just tweak my tapering to get rid of that. There we go. So now I'm back where I was. I'll grab the 1 here. And now when I do my conversion, I'm actually going to go in and not only convert to generate the geometry, but I'm also going to generate a joint chain, which will drive 1 or more pieces of geometry. So in this case, it's just going to be 1. So I'll say 1 joint chain, I'll choose the number of joints, and then I'll also do an auto bind so that when I do the conversion now, that will generate 2 things. It will generate the geometry, but it will also generate the skeleton, which will allow me to control the geometry. So once again, if I just right click and I assign a shader to that, you can see the resulting effect, but then I also now have a joint chain that allows me to either pose and or manipulate the actual card, or if I wanted to actually export this into a game and maybe drive it procedurally or use some other means of animation, dynamic animation in order, or secondary animation in order to generate the motion of the hero hair, I can do that. But again, this is just a simple polystripped standard piece of Maya geometry that can now be exported to a game engine just like any other piece of geometry. But again, the end result is to kind of mimic the look of the XGen effect. So if I were to go in and bring back the rest of my object, and let's just hide a few of these examples in here. We'll just turn off all my instancing and maybe hide this geometry here and maybe hide this piece here. I don't really need my, oops, where did they go? I don't really need my curves anymore. It doesn't really matter. We'll just leave them. But if I go into the channel box, I've got a layer here that has the result of what I just showed you. So this is using a combination of converting directly from guides as well as converting from XGen instances. So here you can see the nape hair is a bunch of cards that are overlapping and kind of collected together to create the overall look of the hair without the instances or without the guides, of course. And then also, if I were to turn on my joints, which are here, I created a number of hero hairs that are connected to skeletons that can be driven dynamically or driven procedurally or driven through some other means in order to create kind of the secondary animation for those hero or flyaway hairs, whether that be in Maya or whether that be in the game engine. So that wraps it up. Hopefully it gives you a good idea of how you can take advantage of what is traditionally thought of as a film visual effects centric tool in XGen and actually use that for other purposes such as real-time game character hair.